Mr. Taubes, is it fair to say that one subtext of your talk is that we are all idiots? I'm like, yeah, it's fair. But I can't say that, right? So but it was exactly the right question. But the conventional wisdom is no fruits and fresh fruits and vegetables, scurvy, death. Okay, test it. Why don't they want to? Because they're not scientists as I understand the word. Hyperpalatable means good tasting, right?
Yeah.
Hyper means a lot.
Yeah.
Well, there's a problem with the science as soon as they're using terminology like that.
Okay. Yeah. So let's use my paper in Snyderman because I think it's a great example. I started this literally the cholesterolcode.com was my blog. Now it's going to be the movie. Yeah. What was I doing? I was iterating. This is what we're doing all the time. It's the experiments, and I'm posting them up, and I'm like, I don't know. I think it's this. I think it's that. I'm seeing comments. I'm then responding to the comments. I'm coming more into the publication world, and there's understandably enormous interest and thought on what's actually going to end up with a PMID next to it, right? Because that's supposed to be the process of where you're actually compiling together not only the existing data as it stands, but a lot of the insights and thoughts and analyses. And for what it's worth, I can say there's a lot of great things about the peer review process and the thoughtfulness that comes into play as to how best to, set up and present the manuscript. And without question, you're connecting me to Alan, I think, has been a wonderful experience because I'll be very upfront that given my prior interactions with virtually all lipidologists, especially if they're highly featured in the NLA and so forth, it's been let's just say mixed. But generally speaking, I kind of hit a threshold point of I think I just need to get more hard data out there before these conversations can really bear fruit. But at the same time, I've had a number of folks that say, listen, if and this includes undergrads, if their careers are built on the lipid hypothesis, particularly if it's like ApoB is the whole game, then it's you're going uphill at a minimum. Probably in some cases, you're not spending your time wisely. Now, I want to concede and own in the case of Alan because he's very much a strong fan of ApoB as being the central driver of atherosclerosis.
He's the promoter of that hypothesis. Yeah. He's been fighting that's one of the reasons why we could relate is because he's been fighting the conventional wisdom, the community for 25 years.
Right. And I have to say my interactions with him have been eye-opening for me, and I have to kind of walk the cat back. I think he really does strike me as a good scientist that I'm hoping I can have further conversations once this paper is published.
Christ, he's in his 80s and he's open-minded. What more can you ask?
Yeah, exactly. So yes, but here's the thing, the approach of treating these manuscripts as though they are like being written in stone is already something that's been a source of frustration for me with my own research partners, my allies, because going back to the blog, it felt like the pure science to me.
I agree with you.
I was capturing, reporting. The analysis between these measurement drops, these data releases, that was very interesting, but understandably mercurial. Lots of things would get determined. The hard work was in the design, and should be in the design of the next experiment. Right. What did the last experiments inform me of such that I could set up a better experiment the next time to test the next thing? And then, what's the postmortem on the experiments that either there was something that went awry in that experiment or, hey, new interesting things came up afterwards. And right now, I feel like there's such a large amount of effort in situating the manuscript of these things as they get published that I miss that rapid iteration. I
Right.
would have loved a scenario where we could have, and I guess it kind of worked out this way. We had preliminary data that we got to release in batches. For example, we did the 64 participants in 21, I want to say 22. This last year, we did the match analysis that got published. But just the process of getting to a publisher, going through peer review process and so forth, it's very long. I know you've been through it now several times. And I know that the culture out there would say, yeah, but necessarily so. There should be a process of shopping between these different publications and so forth. I feel like there's a lot more process than there needs to be. That's definitely my opinion.
I'm curious, did you end up having to specify your reviewers so that you would get reviewers who were open-minded or amenable to the hypothesis, or did you just live with the reviewers? Where is the paper being published? Actually,
Jack Advances.
Okay.
By the time this gets released, everyone will know it'll be Jack Advances. I actually can't speak to the selection of reviewers. That was mainly handled beyond me by my research partners. But I know that can sometimes come up, sometimes it doesn't. I know that the people who we would have interest in are themselves actually versed in this domain. But
the issue with peer review is it can also protect the world from innovative ideas and research.
Exactly, I agree.
And again, I don't know how to solve that. I mean, other people talk about these problems. Jay Bhattacharya, the new director of NIH, talks about these problems. So it's sort of, I've seen it
I have a
happen,
suggestion.
but what's that?
It just needs more transparency. If we had more of the data and the code published, I know it may sound hyper transparent in some cases. Many people would want to have proprietary hold over it, but I like public review over peer review.
Yeah, no, so do I. And there is that to some level with the bulletin boards that you can now post the papers on
preprints.
Yeah.
If you do it, you may still not put up the data. You may choose not to. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, again, it's we're coming from a different perspective on one level. We're both trying to convince people that there's a theory out there that's better than the theory they have. I'm not doing experiments, right? I'm saying there's enough evidence already that this theory should have been rejected. I mean, it was rejected 94 years ago. Why is it still around? I could explain to you why it came back, but let's talk about why it was rejected. It's sort of but the interesting thing is the implication, if we're right, is that the other people aren't. Okay, I may have told you this story. In 2009 or so, I was invited to give a lecture at the Pennington Biomedical Research Institute in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. It's the leading academic obesity research institute in the United States. I gave a talk on why we get fat to basically the carbohydrate insulin thinking to a packed audience, a standing room only. I mean, it's terrific. And when I'm done with my talk, and I'm very careful when I give these talks, so I basically walk people through the logic the word carbohydrate isn't mentioned until 40 minutes into the talk. Because as soon as I mention it, people are going to start thinking Atkins quackery. I want to just get them to think about the logic that we're using to deconstruct energy balance and reconstruct a hypothesis that works. And at the end of the lecture, Q&A period, one of the faculty, gentleman who's probably my age now, so say mid-60s, gray hair, very distinguished, slight European accent, raises his hand and says, "Mr. Taubes, is it fair to say that one subtext of your talk is that we are all idiots?" I'm like, yeah, that's fair. But I can't say that, right? So but it was exactly the right question. That's the funny thing. It was precisely the right question because the subtext is, and I said this, I don't think you're idiots. I think when you entered the field, it's funny how, I mean, this was 16 years ago. I'm still working on this same history now. When you entered the field in the 1960s, you inherited a paradigm that seemed so commonsensical you never questioned it. And that paradigm was energy balance, you get fat because you eat too much. And you've grown up with that paradigm and it was never tested. And now you never even realized that there was an alternative hypothesis that explained the data better. The implication, though, is unacceptable to people. The implication is I spent my whole life wasting time. I spent my whole life promoting the wrong idea. I spent my whole life in career doing damage when I thought I was doing good. All the awards I've won, all the acclaim I've gotten from my peers, it's bullshit. Meaningless because I was wrong and they were wrong. It's like these are assumptions that nobody can embrace.
But it should never, ever have been framed that way. When you're working off the information you had at the time, it should already be de facto standard. In fact, what's that famous phrase that said in medical school, half of what we're going to be teaching you is right, and the other half isn't, and I'm sorry, we can't tell you which is right. So you still get the awards and should have the awards for what was known in the time, so long as we all agree collectively that these paradigms can just fall in an instant tomorrow. While it's set up
critical,
it's set up to be personal, while it's set up to be a...
No, I'm just thinking, you're thinking yourself. It's like, okay, let's say you're wrong. So a year from now, Nick Norwitz and a world of 30-year-olds drop dead from heart attacks. It happens overnight. I mean, this is one of the things that scared me about doing the research on type 1 on diabetes for my diabetes book. And I'll be completely honest about this. Insulin's discovered in 1921. So until 1921, type 1 diabetes is it's an acute disease that kills pretty quickly. It strikes kids and adolescents primarily, and if they can live 2 years, it's great. And this low-carb, high-fat, ketogenic, animal diet will prolong their life, but not by a heck of a lot. And then you got insulin, and now you can keep these people alive, and it's a miracle drug. Kids who seem to be on the brink of death, and patients in diabetic comas could be revived with insulin and brought back to life, and within a month they would look healthy and they could go on and live their lives. And then after about a decade, they start dying of the complications of diabetes that are all too common. So they're going blind, they're having kidney failure, they're having neuropathy and having their limbs amputated, and heart disease and heart attacks and strokes. And they're going from, it's a wonderful, remarkable book written about this called Bittersweet by a endocrinologist, medical historian, medical ethicist at the University of Pennsylvania, where he got the case files from Jocelyn's Institute. And these people seem to be healthy. And then over the course of a year or two, they non-technical term, their bodies crap out, everything goes wrong, and they're dead. And I'm reading this thinking, this could happen with ketogenic diets. We don't know. I mean, we don't have that much of a history of a large population of people being on it. I have a friend who used to joke, poker-playing friend in Los Angeles, used to joke that, if I'm wrong about this, I'm going to have to move to Argentina with the rest of the Nazis who killed millions, There's really no way to know. You can't promise anything because, again, we don't get that information about how long you're going to live doing this.
But you can go get it. You can go get the science.
But
right?
it doesn't mean, for instance, it's not going to give you cancer. There are two people in
Like,
our
agreed.
world, two young people in our world who have died of cancer, friends, allies.
Yeah, agreed.
You know, I mean, again, I can rationalize it, and I have rationalized it, but it worries me. You know, so what you can tell people is, you eat this way, you'll be healthier. You'll feel healthier. Your lipids will improve, except for LDL, which may not, but everything else will. And I think everything else will balance out whatever's happening to LDL, whether it's harmful or not. But that's the best you can say. But if we're wrong, it should be tragic. So we should be able to acknowledge it. But we could already be seeing it, and we wouldn't be acknowledging it. If this increased cancer risk, for instance, I'm rationalizing that away, but I am paying attention.
Well, you're stating it right now, right? So
I'm not completely oblivious.
Exactly. I've been on the record multiple podcasts, including my own, where I've stated it very well could be lean mass hyperresponders that the data will continue to support that there is not an association between ApoB, LDL, and plaque progression, but that's something with lean mass hyperresponders that's outside of our peripheral view, such as cancer, could in fact increase. Can't say that I know for sure. My stating that correctly not only puts me into the state of mind I should be in as a scientist,
exactly.
right?
You're speaking with the proper humility, such that if it turns out, I mean, part of the reason when scientists would talk about humility being an essence of sort of the scientific method is because you're so likely to turn out to be wrong that you better leave yourself an out so you can accept it when it happens.
But that's why the question he asked you that you were repeating that you said was exactly the right question. I had a visceral reaction to it because the setup is, hey, either we're idiots, right? Even though they may have been conducting the science that they had for the time.
Well, no, but the implication is they missed the obvious. So it wasn't, and they didn't do their job as scientists, which was to test, when they inherited this hypothesis, when they entered the field, they should have looked into the history of it. They should have known where it came from and whether there were challenges to it. That's part of the job of doing good science. The problem is as science progresses and you accumulate more and more disciplines and facts and iotas of this and that, and it's like doing the history becomes burdensome, something nobody can do anymore because it's just too much. And whose history? There's true histories and fake histories. It's like, but in the 1960s, they could have done what I did. But they didn't. And they should have done what I did because it was their career. That's what scientists do. When you read, I'm always referring to Richard Feynman's, I gave this famous commencement address in 1974 at Caltech where he taught. The one where he said that the first principle of science is you must not fool yourself and you're the easiest person to fool. And part of it, he talked about the necessity to know the history of the work you've done. It wasn't enough to take somebody's work and try to improve on it. First, you had to make sure that the work you're taking was right. So you had to do that experiment. And then if it turned out to be right, then you could try and do the next experiment.
For me, and I think for many, missing something that could seem obvious in retrospect is actually very forgivable. There's this phenomenon we have in engineering called the junior in the room. It's usually when there's, say, a collection of 4 or 5 senior engineers, they're all on the whiteboard and they're jotting things out and they're deep in this complex architecture. And then this one junior engineer who's kind of in the back is kind of going, "Do you think maybe of just doing and that person has the most brilliant straightforward idea, observation, and we're all kind of like, oh God, I can't believe it. But that humility to acknowledge the junior's idea as being the one that got through all of us, none of us managed to see it. Now we just have to eat crow and go ahead and make the changes.
But you haven't built your whole career on it.
Right. This is why.
So this is where it's a different level of, I mean, there are variations of this. Like I was listening on the way here, Free Press, Barry Weiss's Honestly podcast, and she's interviewed Jay Bhattacharya this week. And I know Jay, and I'm a fan, and I wanted to listen to him, and hopefully he'll talk about the need to do meaningful nutrition research now that he's head of NIH. But he's also talking about the sort of mistakes that Fauci and Francis Collins and their defending of their belief system when they was challenged, the shutdowns were challenged by this great Barrington Declaration that Jay co-authored with a colleague at Harvard and a colleague at Oxford. And it's, at some point in there, it's a very extreme environment because you've got an epidemic and people are dying and you feel like you have to act, but you also feel like you can't afford to allow that act to be questioned because then people won't follow your advice anymore. So you can't allow for dissent, but you also have to convince yourself that you did the right thing. Okay, you acted and tens of hundreds of millions of lives depended on it. And it's very hard not to convince yourself that you did the right thing. And the rationale is based on what we knew then. We made a reasonable decision. They're never going to get to the point where they say, it turned out it was a wrong decision and we caused far more harm than we blame. People just have trouble getting there. I'm going to have trouble getting there if that's the case. You're going to have trouble getting. I mean, people would already say I'm there.
But part of what we're doing now makes it easier. So
yes, that's partially why we do it. So I could say, yeah, exactly.
So it's let's say that some landmark study is done. I'm even helping them recruit for it, where they're checking long-term cancer incidence with lean mass hyperresponders, and some data is emerging to be suggestive on that front, right? I could correctly say, listen, this entire time I've been saying that, and but this gets me back to, while there's a lot of forgiveness for the missing things, even obvious things, where I do feel a bit ornery is the lack of course correction. When there seems to be a doubling down and a tripling down and a quadrupling down and a building of entire systems that help to keep out what, continues to come your way to change something.
Well, this is, I may have talked about this in Croydon when we did that interview. I refuse to refer to it as London because it's like that was not London. I've been to London. That was not London.
Well, we should fit this in real quick because what you're talking about is at the PHC last year, and this is where we got an interview with you that ends up making it into the documentary. Yeah. But I took a picture, a selfie, and I put it up on Twitter, and I said in Croydon, is that what it is? Croydon. And I took the picture. A bunch of my British friends were like, "Hey, so that's not the whole UK."
Anyway, they one of my favorite papers that I'm constantly sharing with people from the 1890s in scientific method is by a guy named Thomas T.C. Chamberlain, The Method of Multiple Working Hypotheses. And T.C. Chamberlain was a well-known geologist, the responsible on some level for the idea that the shifting of the continental drift, and he was a president of the American Association of Scientists, and so he the idea of this article was how to do science right. And he said there are various ways to do it. There's the method of the dominant hypothesis, where you just get like one hypothesis and you try to prove it's true, and you get fall in love with it, and that's the end of that. And then you could have competing hypotheses, but he says we need multiple working hypotheses. You got to think of as many possible explanations as you can for anything you're seeing, and then you're testing all these different hypotheses at the same time, and so you're not going to fall in love with one of them. Because as soon as you fall in love with one of them, that's the end of it. Nothing positive is going to come out of your work ever since, unless by some freak of nature you get lucky and nature is kind to you and you happen to pick the right hypothesis. But it's sort of as soon as you embrace one over the rest, that's the end of it. That's because you're going to everything you can, and then there's all this 100 years of sort of cognitive psychology
because you
research
want to
showing.
defend it.
Not only are you going to want to, you're going to see this. Francis Bacon said this in 1620 when he more or less developed the scientific method. I'd like to refer to him as the Abner Doubleday of the scientific method. But he said, basically as soon as, our brains are wired to see the evidence that supports our beliefs and to reject the evidence that doesn't. And that's just the way we are. And so the whole scientific method was some way to combat that human tendency such that we would actually, in an ideal world, give more credence to the evidence that refutes our hypothesis. And he tells this wonderful story about this, where a guy who survives a shipwreck, doesn't survive a shipwreck, walks into a tree. He's trying to decide whether or not to become religious, and he walks into a church, and he's talking to the priest about whether he should believe in God. And the priest shows him this painting, and it's like 5 people who survived the shipwreck, and the priest says, look at these people, they believed in God. And they survived the shipwreck. That's proof that God exists. And this is the 5 positives, true positives. And the questioner says, well, what about all the other people on the ship? They believed on God and they didn't survive. And that's the negative evidence. And that's more powerful than the positive evidence. Like believing in God clearly doesn't make a difference, or 95 people died for every 5 who survived. Science is about paying attention to the negative evidence. And then when you're trying to move science forward, there's this tricky sort of line you have to cross between having faith in your theories. Because if you don't, you're not going to keep doing the work because people are letting you have it every day. I mean, it's not easy fighting the establishment, trying to convince these people that they're... What was I just reading? Something else where somebody talked about like spending 30 years, this was, 100 years ago, spending 30 years getting shellacked by his critics. And he said no insult was spared. And he turned out to be right. That's why I'm reading his memoirs today. But it's sort of, so you've got to have faith. And yet simultaneously, you've got to be assuming you're wrong. Not everybody is wired to do that. It's a very tricky.
I kind of had a bit of an advantage in being able to abandon this at any time, because I actually was, I was a successful entrepreneur developer,
right,
building these platforms, and have gotten many opportunities sent my direction all throughout this. And it's literally the truth that at any point in time, if there was enough evidence accumulated that I could say, oh, I'm wrong.
right,
I could blog it out, drop everything I'm doing, and return to software development and make a lot more money than I'm doing now, right? It's this irony, because I sort of feel a friend of mine, an engineer friend of mine, says you're like the John McClane of reluctantly stuck in this tower and getting shot at and so forth, but waiting for the cavalry to arrive so that it could, the science could be taken up for me. Now I don't have to worry about it.
Did you just go from Vietnam to the Old West then?
No, John McClane from Die Hard.
Oh, that John. I'm thinking of John McCain. Yeah, John McClane. Okay.
No, just that, it's a fascinating situation I never would have thought. Make no mistake, when I started, I kept thinking, I'm just like a few weeks away or a few months away from getting a hold of one of these people who's going to take this and run with it. Yeah. And they got a whole PhD team that's all just ready to go. They're going, gosh, I wish there was some new lipid work we could be doing right now with all of our grant money. That was my naive setup for the longest time. But even as the inversion pattern was coming up and lipid energy model, all that sort of stuff, this just always seemed like an obvious population to study for
Right.
getting the clean signal. And
obvious is again depends on what you're seeing.
But
I was
true.
a funny story. I went to one of the most depressing days I've spent in the last couple of years. I went out to Stanford. So I'm in Oakland. Stanford's in Palo Alto on the other side of the bay. It's an hour drive. So they were having a nutrition symposium, and some of the metabolic mind people were going. So I thought I'd go as well. And I'm watching these songs. And Stanford's a very mostly planned vegan, vegetarian diet, Dogma. So, and they're just, whatever they're teaching, they're very smart students. They're not teaching them how to think. As far as I'm concerned, they're teaching them what to think, which is a very different experience. And afterwards, I'm talking to one of the leading gut biome researchers in the world, because they were talking about the necessity of consuming fiber to have a healthy gut biome, and the gut biome having this great influence on chronic disease health. And I said to him, you think fiber is an essential part of a healthy diet, but you actually have a population of people now, carnivores. I mean, it's a unique time in history where you could study the gut biome and chronic disease health of people who don't eat fiber and test your damn hypothesis. And he looked at me like I was from Mars. I mean, I didn't say test your damn hypothesis. I mean, he was, it's an interesting thought, maybe someday. I've gotten that response often. That's interesting. Maybe someday. It means like
gotten
there's
a few of those.
This look in their eyes. There's the look of cognitive dissonance. Oh, I've never really thought of that. That's interesting. How can I reconcile that with everything I know? Okay, well, what I'll say is it's interesting. Who knows? And then I'll put it out of my mind forever and never think about it again. But if I were studying gut biome and thought fiber was some critical aspect of human diets, the first thing I would want to do is study people who don't eat it. Or maybe they're all sneaking fiber supplements on the side they're not telling us, but we can test that. Okay, and we can see what happens when you eat a fiber-free diet, which I assume carnivore is. I mean, what a unique opportunity. So if I grew up in the physics community, in the physics world, the one thing you want to do is learn something, find or create an experiment that will see something nobody else has ever seen before and will demonstrate that your mentors were idiots. It's like, right, that's the joy of physics. I mean, that's you grow up wanting to prove that the people who taught you how to think didn't know how to think themselves. Okay, what greater joy would there be in life? And so here you have this carnivore, this population of people who don't eat fiber, they don't take vitamin supplements. According to conventional wisdom, they should all be dead of scurvy within the first 3 months of going on the diet. We know that's not true because we know experiments that tested it 100 years ago. But the conventional wisdom is no fruits and fresh fruits and vegetables, scurvy, death. Okay? Test it. Why don't they want to? Because they're not scientists as I understand the word. That's the only way I could think of it. The way they think about their careers is not to, Thomas Kuhn, when he talked about paradigms, there's normal science and then there's, I forget what phrase he used, but when paradigms shift and you get this sort of revolutionary science, and normal science is just adding bricks to the dogma. So you've got this dogma that's been built up. You can imagine it's a brick wall, and you put a brick here, and your PhD thesis is a brick here, and then another brick on top of it, but you're left with the same wall. People think of science as that. They're trained, at least in nutrition, chronic disease. You're not taught to think out of the box. I mean, imagine if they just recommended, can we study carnivores? Why are they alive?
Even
why aren't they constipated?
Yeah.
If nothing else, what's going on with their gut biome? They don't eat fiber.
Even as you were telling me that, another analogy is we call that in code spaghetti code. If it's just a bunch of code built on code, it's because there was no refactor, there was no revision.
Yeah.
There's so many times that we've lived through where everything's torn down and reset it's very, so you know how you mentioned, because you didn't have your whole career based on it. I used to be very adept at ActionScript 3. That's the language of Adobe Flash. I don't know if you knew this. Adobe Flash at one point in time was the best way to make experiential sites back in the day when that was a big deal, and games and ads and a number of different things. The problem is that some bad programmers could take too much advantage of it and actually made some very bloated sites that had all sorts of problems to them, right? And ultimately what happened was Steve Jobs wrote a letter that says thoughts on Flash. It turned out to be a catalyst event where the sentiment started shifting. And today, almost nothing is built in Flash for the web, maybe some things for apps under specific conditions. But I had to just entirely abandon where I was the most adept. But if I had had a lot of control, let's say I was part of a blue ribbon committee, right, on standards for the web, I could have made the case as to why Flash was great. And it was just these poor actors over here that were a problem. And, we're going to have standards that they'll need to apply by. That's human nature to, of course, protect.
Well, that's all the more you have invested emotionally, psychologically, your family. Like, I could do what I did as a journalist in part because I was a freelance journalist. I was constitutionally averse to working in corporations, which is also possibly the same sort of psychological mindset that leads a person to challenge an entire research establishment. But if I worked within those organizations, on the one hand, like if I worked for the New York Times, I could have gotten, and the New York Times got behind my work, we could have shifted the paradigm because the New York Times has the imprimatur to do it. But on the other hand, they'd be hesitant to get behind it. Like I could write the pieces I wrote for the New York Times Magazine because I was kind of independent. But if I had tried to do it for the magazine itself, all these editors are going to get involved or are going to say, can we trust this? What if we do more harm than good? We're likely to do harm. We don't want people to eat differently than they're supposed to eat. And it's sort of, and then if I, by that, instead of being, how old was I when I did this? 35. Let's say I was 50 then and had kids and a family and a position that I had to sustain to keep them fed. The risks and benefits of thinking outside the box change as you get older, as more invested you are to the existence of the box.
And naturally, you can't help but think advertisers, companies to the New York Times.
Well, they're also going to have, although
it's not going to be a 0% influence. It's not going to be 100% influence, but it's not going to be a 0.
Yeah, I like to think, and again, I have friends who always accuse me of being naive, but I like to think that in journalism, the editor doesn't exist who's going to say to a reporter, we're getting pressure from our advertisers. Not in good journalism.
No, but this is a crucial component in that I think a lot of times people aren't overtly committing wrongdoing. I do think that there's motivated reasoning. I do think that there's, I myself might favor something a little more subconsciously than I want to take the time to examine to find out I'm doing subconsciously. And that's why you've got to have this culture in place, right? So you're right. I think that good journalists, hopefully, are just following the story, just like good scientists should be following the data.
But their context is everything.
It is. It's not like you're not going to, particularly when you make relationships, particularly when you have friends that you're connecting with business to business, and you're aware of their disappointment with you if you seem to be holding up something that they're against, or that becomes
remember,
relevant.
Context is what you're seeing also. So let me tell you my favorite story about perspective and bias from personal experience. So 2001, I wrote this infamous New York Times Magazine article, What If It's All Been a Big Fat Lie? It's on the cover of the Times. The picture is this greasy, porterhouse steak with a pat of butter on it. Maybe it was a ribeye. I can't remember. Okay. shellacked in the press. Like, I knew it was going to be the most controversial article they had run in a decade, since a friend of mine, John Tierney, wrote a piece saying that recycling was a complete waste of time and money and didn't accomplish anything. I
don't
had
know
no
if anyone
idea.
ever asked you this. Did you know at that time it would be as big as it became, that article?
No idea, but I knew it would be very controversial. I had no idea how very controversial would manifest itself, which was my own friends in journalism going after me, accusing me of selling out, of one of my friends who, until that moment, had considered me one of the 3 best science medicine reporters in the world, wrote a piece for Newsweek, I think, called "It's Not the Carbs, Stupid," and basically accused me of having a brain transplant. We had trouble, our friendship, that was pretty much the end of it. I mean, we stayed in sporadic touch afterwards, but I got pieces. The Washington Post did a hit piece on me, and I was accused. Reason magazine ran a big story accusing me of all these journalistic sins. The primary one being not listening to the authorities, who, but then of setting up the research site interviewed. So the people I quoted didn't really mean what I quoted them to say. It's completely bogus. Like one of the people who did it made this accusation was John Farquhar, and I quoted him he was a colleague of Jerry Reevens at Stanford, and I quoted him at the end of the story saying that maybe the low-fat proponents should apologize. And he said he had no idea of the story. The idea was I knew somehow that I was going to be writing a story that was going to defend the Atkins diet, and I had suckered him into this quote. And I actually had the emails, the exchange where he said the quote to me in reference to an article that David Ludwig had written that had been published in JAMA, and he sent the article to him. He said this quote, and I actually responded to him, are you okay with that being on the record? Because you might regret it. If it is, and he said, no, that's fine. And I had the emails, and then when people attacked me, I had to say, look, I asked him how many journalists would have asked for such a great quote. I asked him if it was okay if I used it, and he said yes, and here's the proof. But 20 years later, I'm pitching a variation on that story to the New York Times Magazine, which I want to describe the history of everything we've discussed. The history of this energy balance thinking, how it vanishes with World War, how the fuel partitioning theory vanishes with World War II, and the implications since then. And I want to interview researchers about this. And in the last stand of the fuel partitioning hypothesis was in 1961, and it was there's very prominent endocrinologist at Tufts University, arguably the most accomplished endocrinologist of that era, who's president of the Endocrine Society. And he gives his Endocrine Society talk. It's called the Heritage of Corpulence. And he talks about the link between obesity and genetics and how people want to blame it on eating too much, but it's not eating too much. He says a fat lady doesn't get into the circus by being a glutton. It's like the pig doesn't become so big. It's like pigs aren't fat because they eat a lot. They eat a lot because they're fat. And then there's all these hormones and enzymes that regulate fat storage and fatty acid mobilization. And he would bet there's dozens of them, and any number of combinations could explain obesity. And if somebody was programmed to be obese because of their hormones, that would make them hungry all the time. And then the fact that they were constantly being told it was their fault and that they had to starve themselves would explain the psychological problems and send them off to the shrinks. But it all starts with this disorder of sort of the hormones and enzymes that regulate fat storage and metabolism. Brilliant talk. This guy, Edwin Ass, was a terrific speaker. He's funny and witty. And so I take that talk, I attach it to the emails I'm sending out to these researchers, And I'm saying, I'm doing a story for the New York Times Magazine. They had accepted this again as a proposal on whatever happened to the way of thinking that Edwin Aswood describes in the attached paper, because I don't want to be accused of setting anyone up. I should say, when I did the first story 20 years ago, when I interviewed these people, I didn't know what I was going to write. Then I ended up writing a story. They assumed, again, not unjustly, I mean, it was a natural that I knew what I was going to write when I interviewed him, and so had led them into this trap. But the point is, until you do the research, you don't know what you're going to write. This time I was going to tell them what I was going to write. I knew what the story was. I didn't want to be accused of leading them on. And some huge proportion of researchers who responded to me said, oh, I'm happy to talk to you. I completely agree with everything that Aswood article says. And the reason I was interviewing them is because they don't. Because their perspective was completely energy balanced, and I wanted to know why they interpreted their work from that perspective when there was also this other perspective. They read that Aswood article and saw something entirely different than I did. They saw him saying there was a link between obesity and genetics, which they agreed with, and so they said they agreed with the article. I saw him talking about obesity being a fuel partitioning article. I also agreed genetic. But because of our perspectives, we saw something entirely different. The same article, the same facts we've interpreted entirely differently depending on our belief system. It's fascinating.
It really is, because I'm amazed that there's any debate, at least with regard to the consistency we have just internally ourselves throughout these stages of life. That was the first time during one of your presentations early on, you just got to thinking about the very obvious ones, such as puberty or pregnancy, right? Which brings it back to kind of the animal models, such as the dog you mentioned being given the growth hormone.
Right.
Nothing's else changed. Nothing has changed other than the hormone being introduced. And then that has a clear, demonstrable effect on the appetite to then go and get the additional food that would support the growth itself. Right. It is, I feel like GLP-1, I mean, isn't this been a kind of a large debate as GLP-1 inhibitors have agonists, have come into play? Is that clearly there's more of a direct awareness of the hormonal component?
Yes, but the assumption is the hormonal component works in the brain to suppress appetite, or it works in the gut to slow gastric emptying, which keeps blood sugar under control, which in turn, makes people less hungry. But again, context is everything. The belief system is eating too much makes people fat. We give them a drug. What we see is they get thinner and they eat less. We assume, because of our belief system, that it's eating less that causes the getting thinner. The counter hypothesis is it's the getting thinner that causes the eating less. But they don't have that context with which to interpret the data, and they're not going to listen to me. Although one of our supporters is head of the major player in the Novo Nordisk Foundation, which is the Danish foundation that gets money from the Novo Nordisk pharmaceutical companies, which has become like richer than Croesus because of these drugs. So, again, everything depends. When you look at the history, there were no animal models of obesity. That's not true. The first one was like 1927. A guy at Stanford identified a genetic mutation that he could breed and create a breed of obese. I forget if they were rats or mice. I think they were probably rats back then. And the fact that they didn't even look really whether these rats, how much they ate, they didn't measure that. They just had rats that were genetically predisposed to get fat, and there was clearly family histories. Researchers had always known, even in the 19th century, that most of their obese patients had obese or diabetic family members or family members with gout. The first easily reproducible animal model of obesity was developed in the late 1930s, first at in Chicago by a guy named Stephen Ranson, had a laboratory. He was one of the leading brain anatomists in the world, and he had a graduate student who pioneered this technique to put a lesion into a specific area of the brain. Like you could really direct the lesion directly in an animal as small as a rat. These devices had been used on dogs before, but so now you could lesion the ventromedial hypothalamus of a rat and it would get reproducibly obese. And I mean, it's fascinating. This guy Hetherington, the postdoc actually. There was another postdoc in the lab named John Brobeck. And John Brobeck, the war was coming up, and John Brobeck decided to go to med school. So John Brobeck goes to Yale to go to med school, and at med school at Yale, he needs to get a job to make some money, so he gets a job doing research, and they have one of these instruments, they're called stereotaxic instruments, that Hetherington had used to create these obese rats. So Brobeck starts doing it, and he creates an obese rat, and the rat eats voraciously. Okay, I mean, just scarfs down the food from the moment that you're done with the surgery and the anesthetic wears off. The animal's eating voraciously, and then it's getting obese. And so Brobeck decides that he's discovered what he calls hypothalamic hyperphagia, meaning excessive eating, hyperphagia, and that's his discovery. He just assumes the hyperphagia causes the obesity. And Hetherington and Ranson was the brain anatomist. He's thinking some of their animals are hyperphagic, eat excessively after the surgery and get obese, but some of them are not. They're very sedentary and get obese. And rather than think that the surgery creates either excessive hunger or sedentary behavior, the simpler way to think of it is that the surgery in the brain triggers something in the central nervous system that stimulates fat accumulation. And once you stimulate fat accumulation, like giving the dog's growth hormone, you're going to get either a hungrier animal or an animal that has to be economical with the energy it does have. So maybe the surgery is causing the animals either to get obese. I mean, it's causing the animals to accumulate fat. You don't know via what mechanism. And that in turn is causing either the hyperphagia or the sedentary behavior. So you've got two competing hypotheses that's paralleling what the Germans had been arguing about.
But importantly, in these models, the food composite, like it's not ultra processed food.
Well, it's rat chow, so it's ultra processed. But
the point being is that there's not a difference between the control group and the experiment group.
No. It's just. But the interesting thing here is, so by now it's the early 1940s. The war is fully engaged. The U.S. is in the war. Stephen Ranson dies of a heart attack, the mentor. Hetherington, the postdoc in Chicago, joins the Air Force. John Brobeck is the only one left doing these operations. And Brobeck's theory is the surgery creates hyperphagia, the hyperphagia creates obesity. The surgery creates voracious appetite, the voracious appetite makes a fat rat. Hetherington survived the war, as far as I could tell, but never went back into research. Actually did some research for the Air Force, apparently. Brobeck becomes a leading figure in the field. It's his animal model. Now, other researchers are studying this, and they're saying, well, if you don't let the animal manifest its voracious appetite, it gets obese anyway. So you control for overeating, the animal still gets fat, but
you can make them.
But they get fatter.
Right.
They get fatter if you let them eat too much. So eating too much is the cause of obesity.
Right. And so part of why I brought up the the quote unquote ultra processed this is sort of, ironically, it feels more and more like this is becoming the competitor that's brought up a lot against the carbohydrate insulin model, that there's this hyperpalatable food environment of ultra processed foods, and that the foods, this is external to the body, right? The foods themselves have a causal component to, Pringles, for example, once you pop, you can't stop, and other kinds of donuts are low in protein, high in fat and carbs. How much of that is, in your opinion, a component? Maybe it's not the entirety.
The world is full of people who struggled with their weight who don't eat this shit.
Yeah.
And for starters, I was one of them. I suppose, I don't know, you lived in Vegas. Maybe you lived on Pringles. But when I described my 10 years in the 90s, I did eat pasta, but that's not an ultra-processed food. It's one ingredient, processed. It's, just the word hyperpalatable triggers me. I was thinking about this the other day. It's like anyone who uses that word in all seriousness should be dragged out on the streets. If I were king of the universe, that'd be the end of their scientist career. What you're saying is it tastes really good. Okay? Speak English. We don't need, hyperphagia means overeating. It means voracious eating originally. Now it's used to mean overeating without being measured. You have no idea how much the animal's eating. It's obese, it's hyperphagic. Hyperpalatable is a term used for what? Food that tastes really good. It's like, hyperpalatable means good tasting, right?
Yeah.
Hyper means a lot.
Yeah.
Well, there's a problem with the science as soon as they're using terminology like that.
Well, it's okay.
And then remember, one of the things obesity researchers agree on is we cannot blame this disorder on behavior. But the behavior, I had a long conversation with email and Zoom calls with Julia Belluz, who's co-authoring a book with Kevin Hall that's going to be out any week now about, I think instead of being called Why We Get Fat, it's called Why We Eat or something like that, or Why We Eat Too Much. And Julia, who I like, I hope she likes me, doesn't understand why I think this is a behavioral explanation. To say that, there's all this ultra-processed food and it's addictive, it's got designed by evil industry scientists such that it's a bliss point so you can't say no, so you don't stop when you're supposed to stop. What's the difference between people who get obese in this ultra-processed food environment and people who don't?
Right.
Okay, that's the question you're always asking. Why is, and we know there are people... I know
what the likely explanation will be. They're going to say, they just don't eat as much. They're more disciplined. And
so now we're talking about willpower, aren't
we?
Right. As soon as you use that phrase, more disciplined, we're in willpower. And we've decided that obesity is not caused by a lack of willpower. And yet we're stuck with an explanation, which blames willpower. As soon as we talk about ultra-processed food addiction, I was a cigarette smoker for 20 years. I was addicted. What did it take to quit? Finally, it took enough willpower and Nicorettes, which I still chew on occasion 25 years after I quit. Okay? But one way or the other, I could not rationalize. The fact that nicotine was addictive did not change the fact that being able to quit that addiction on some level took sufficient willpower, and not quitting was a failure of willpower because I know other people could quit. Okay, I don't see how you get around that other than you start using these multisyllabic words that allow you to make it sound like there's some science explaining the fact that we're back to blaming obesity on willpower. It's just we can't stop eating ultra-processed food. I get it. I have a sweet tooth. I know what it means to probably be addicted to sugar, although I think it's a different type of addiction than nicotine. I think it's more akin to alcohol than nicotine. Probably not only different parts of the brain, but maybe even different organs. That's a conversation we don't have time for.
But to further the point, I have been a chronic soda drinker my whole life. going on a ketogenic diet, I had to switch over to diet soda. I kind of alternated a little bit with water, but I still drink a lot of diet soda. I could argue, hey, the sweetness of the soda, the structure of it in my life, etc., those are all components. But I don't find myself saying, I really just have to have the carbohydrate-rich version such that I'm going to quit the diet soda. So
well, this is
you could argue the diet soda is hyperpalatable food.
No, and that's my friend and colleague. So when I was doing the research for Good Calories, Bad Calories, one of the hundreds of researchers I interviewed was this fellow Mark Friedman, who was then at Monell Labs in Philadelphia, which is an industry-funded lab that studies things like taste and hunger. And he's a physiological psychologist, and it's associated with Penn. And I thought Mark was probably the best scientist I interviewed in the field in terms of thinking the way I want a scientist to think. And you mention a study, Mark will remember the study, he'll remember the problems with the whatever methodology they use and the techniques, and I'll talk about the other studies that were related to it. The other day I emailed him because I hike with a guy in Berkeley who just bought the local snake and reptile shop, the famous East Bay Vivarium. And he was telling me they had a two-headed snake. And this two-headed snake, very rare, this particular breed. Two-headed snakes are not that rare, but this particular breed, species, very rare. And he said that there's a dominant head and a submissive head. And the dominant head one does all the eating. And the submissive head gets hungry, gets cranky, and will snap at the dominant head while the dominant head's eating because it's pissed off that it's not getting to eat too. But then once the dominant head is done and they're digesting, the submissive head becomes satiated also and calms down and is fine and experiences a satiation. This is a sort of a twist on a kind of experiment that biologists have been doing with rodents for years, where they're called parabiotic experiments, where you take two rodents and you sew them together and connect their circulatory systems so they share whatever's circulating in the circulation. It's how the leptin more or less was discovered.
It's actually a very interesting way of testing.
Well, this is what, so I emailed Mark. I forget why I brought Mark up to begin with. Okay, but I emailed Mark, and when I got home and I got photos of the snake from my buddy, and I sent it to Mark, and I said, I think this snake might be an advance on parabiosis, because they're sharing the whole body, not just the circulatory system, and it might be an interesting thing to study. And Mark immediately said, oh, well, Burkhardt did this in 1989. It's like 20 minutes later, I have the PDF of this Burkhardt study with the two-headed snake, observations. The point, why did I bring up Mark? What were we talking about?
I think we were talking about hyperpalatable food.
Okay, so Mark, his specialty is he's a physiological psychologist, and he was one of the reasons I wanted to interview him is because I read a seminal paper he wrote in 1977. I discussed it in Good Calories, Bad Calories, where he basically broke down the field and reassembled it with a new hypothesis. He wrote it with a guy named Ed Stricker. Mark was a postdoc at the time, and Stricker was a influential member of the field. And I'd never seen, it's kind of critical thinking I was used to seeing in physics, but had never seen in nutrition. It's one exception. And Mark has always wanted to do a, because you can disassociate hyperpalatability from fat accumulation. Okay, you can disassociate, so there are foods you can demonstrate that animals consider hyperpalatable, like artificially sweetened beverages.
Well, I even have another example that I had from earlier.
Yeah.
I had a keto chow shake, which is about as processed as you can imagine.
Yeah.
Right, with heavy whipping cream added.
Yeah.
I've never gained weight on those. I can try to consume extra on purpose and kind of push past the satiety, but
well, so this is the interesting, when you get, I told you I've been discussing what studies could be done with this influential obesity researcher. And so I think we could overfeed people hyperpalatable foods that don't stimulate insulin secretion. So and this would refute the energy balance hypothesis, because the energy balance hypothesis says if I force feed you 120% of the calories you need to maintain your weight, doesn't matter what the calories are, you're going to get fatter. But I think because of the carbohydrate insulin model, I could probably do that with a diet that doesn't stimulate insulin secretion. If you don't stimulate insulin secretion, you don't have fat accumulation. And if you don't have fat, so we should be able to disassociate overeating from fat accumulation. And we can make it hyperpalatable to make it easy. Now, for me, steaks are hyperpalatable. So I also get pissed when I have to define hyperpalatable as some kind of processed crap I never liked.
Right.
But when I was 25, I could eat, when I was in high school, we used to go to a local restaurant called Emerson's in suburban Maryland that Thursday nights had all the steak you could eat and all the beer you could drink. And so the kids from the football team would go, and it would piss off the owner of Emerson's because we would try to eat as many steaks as we could. And the service was terrible because they made you really drag it out. And eventually I think I ate 7 steaks one night. That was the record.
Wow.
Roast prime rib. I had no off switch with prime rib. Could eat it endlessly. Could I do it day after day after day after day? Probably not, because the body would self-regulate. Too much protein, too many calories. It doesn't want to can't store the protein as muscle fast enough, and doesn't want to store the fat as fat. And eventually, after 2 or 3 days, I probably couldn't look at a prime rib without getting nauseous. But there are ways you can test these hypotheses. The hyperpalatable thing, you can disassociate. The animal studies were clear. You could disassociate hyperpalatability from fat storage. Didn't matter how good it tasted. If it didn't have an effect on the hormones, enzymes that regulate fat storage, and that's the calories in it or the sugar. Fructose has a different effect than glucose. Protein has a different effect from fructose and glucose. Fat has a different effect from all of them. It's going to depend on that, not on the
my
taste.
brain literally, I'm going to say them again, but they're not a sponsor or anything. I know the bears, so I know Keto Chow. But my brain immediately went there. I could just have an experiment that would be super pure by only having the heavy whipping cream as one side, and then actually having a sugar version that's on the other side, using the exact same mix, right? So in that way, it's as ultra processed in both cases. It'd just be a difference of what the composition.
The problem is you have to want to do the experiment. And if you do the experiment, so you have to be open-minded enough to do the experiment. And if you do the experiment, I'm going to have to use the restroom again.
Yeah.
Yes, just to backtrack, there was a called confounder in your Diet Coke palatability, hyperpalatability example, which is it's true that you could switch from Coke to Diet Coke and not get fat on the Diet Coke when you're getting fat on the Coke, or you are fat on the Coke, but the Coke has calories and the Diet Coke doesn't. So it could just be an energy balance thing. That's where the eating less on keto diets gets confusing, because I think back to, I know I ate large portions of food when I was...
But I was speaking more of that toward the hyperpalatability characteristic with regard to consumption amount, right? In other words, how was I able to substitute one thing that's hitting the bliss point with another thing that's hitting the bliss point, right?
Well, and so this is and this is where they talk about hyperpalatability and energy density together. So it's not just hyperpalatability, it's hyperpalatability with energy density. The Diet Coke doesn't have any energy. There is no energy density, so the hyperpalatability becomes irrelevant there. But if you've got energy dense hyperpalatable foods, probably a French fry being the iconic example. I'm assuming it's energy dense. It's, or a Coca-Cola. On some level, I have so many problems with it in so many different ways. I mean, beer. Everyone acknowledges that beer is fattening. Is it hyperpalatable? Is it ultra processed? I mean, I don't know a lot about beer production, but I'm assuming that if I go and buy an Irish beer in a pub in Ireland, it's going to be less processed than Budweiser, but is it more or less fattening?
Butter is hyper processed, right?
And another example, I was thinking about this the other day. Have you ever found anything that was harder to stop eating than popcorn in a movie theater? Okay, and popcorn is not, it's a kernel. It's one on one. I mean, okay, we could put butter and salt on it, and now we're getting really ultra processed, but a lot of people don't even like their popcorn with butter and salt. It doesn't matter. It's, you eat it, right? You just keep eating it. It's what popcorn is. Now, maybe putting you in front of if you weren't in a movie theater, it wouldn't happen, but I bet if we put a bag of popcorn on your desk while you worked, that popcorn would be gone by the end of the day. There's nothing more hyperpalatable than popcorn. There's nothing ultra processed about it. And what is it? I mean, is popcorn better than seared foie gras? I would say the seared foie gras is far more palatable, but I could stop eating one. I couldn't stop eating the other.
It's true though. It's just, I don't know what the characteristic, and I want to try to be fair to anybody who's not in the room with us, but I don't know that I've ever seen something that says, here's a decent objective characterization of what we mean when we say ultra processed hyperpalatable. Because even just what you're saying right now, some people don't like popcorn with the salt and butter on it. Okay, what's going on with those folks? Are they eating more or less?
Well, that's what I guarantee you. In the 90s, I was not putting butter on my popcorn because the 90s was my low-fat era. But I guarantee you I was eating popcorn because I knew that popcorn was a low-fat food.
And you were still gaining weight.
And I was still gaining weight. But it's not an ultra product. Again, the world to me is full now of these sort of, there's this, when science went from being a kind of a self-funded pursuit and obsession to a profession, which again sort of was spurred post-World War II by the federal funding for science and suddenly and the growth of industry and technology. So there are all those uses, but research science became a profession that you could pursue. You didn't become a biologist because there were questions you were desperate to answer. You became a biologist because you could have a career as a biologist. And depending on who you did your PhD with and what you did your PhD on might depend on what you've been researching, then you have to get funding. But
that's my story. Like literally, it's curiosity first. Now I'm mixed in with the researchers who themselves have careers based around us, and how the process of curation of getting everything together and published and under what I'm more aware of other people's participation and where they're at in their careers are than I am my own with regard to this research that I was spearheading.
Well, this is on some level, yeah. I was thinking about that. You're not the last author and you're not the first author on the papers. I'm never the last or the first author on the papers I'm involved in, but I've never done the primary writing. But I assume that it's a conscious decision to bury the software engineer from Vegas in the middle of the author list where he's likely to demonstrate fewer red flags.
There's broad agreement among everybody I'm working with that I put in the most sweat equity as far as like actually putting this whole thing together. Sure, but there's this other factor, which is I honestly don't care as much as they do. So it's kind of like it's a easy giveaway, if you will, right? It's the same thing with the whole awards thing. Yeah, I mean, do I want credit for the work I'm doing 100%? But this gets back to the thing I was talking about.
I mean, let's put it this way. If 20 years from now, this is Norwitz's theory of lean mass hyper-responders, are you going to be bitter?
I mean, I won't say it's going to have an inconsequent, but Norwitz,
sorry.
Yeah, but Nick is doing such a phenomenal job of pushing it, right? Like he's incredible. And so to that extent, it's like, No, where I would feel more bitter is if it was some unknown person who was and called it some entirely different thing, and then claimed in some other, research thing that they did long after me. Oh, hey, did you know? And then I'd feel differently.
Yeah, and that's kind of the progress of science, regrettably. That famous saying about first they say you're wrong, then they say
It's self-evident.
It's self-evident, and then it's like we knew it all along, and then or they take credit. I forget how, but
yeah,
it's kind of
like that.
like in the carbohydrate insulin model. Now there are people who are saying, well, we always took into account insulin, and it's in the model, but it's not in the model. It's not even in your model now. You just say it is, but you look at your model, it's not there. It's can't be in your model if you're saying this is about energy balance. It's my concern is not credit or not, it's the
well, in the case of both of us, we're already kind of embedded in the larger story. It's not. I mean, everybody who knows of us is not going to forget, right? So it's
no, but the issue, what worries me is like I'm always thinking about how would you test this again, like this conversation. What study could you do that would convince people that using the word overeating in reference to obesity is going to put you down a path that you'll never get back from. Okay, so
because it's descriptive within the word.
It's as soon as you're talking about overeating, it's then the problem is
the
eating
over
behavior.
Is the qualifier.
Yeah,
the over is self-determinative. Right?
Yes, on a great level, and it determines what you study. It determines how you interpret what you study, and it determines whether you say it or not. How you perceive people with obesity.
It'd be like if I studied cars that were over fast, right? The fact that I describe them as over fast, and I say over fast cars get in more car accidents. Well, yes, because there's the descriptor over built into it.
Well, that's as soon as you say that, as soon as you say too much, what's the problem? Too much carbohydrates. Well, if there's a problem, there was too much of something. So the existence of the problem tells you there's too much of something, but any amount of carbohydrates could be too much. So the problem is not too much carbs, it's carbs. It depends how you talk about it. But I worry that as fashions in science move on with the technologies, the people who could even do the experiments evaporate. So that you end up wanting to experiments that nobody does anymore. You not just said you can't get funding, but they literally don't do them anymore. They have no idea how to do them. It's not what they do. Like if you go into a genetics lab, they're not studying obesity. They're not full of people with obesity. They're full of rats and mice and, high throughput sequencing machines, and it's got nothing. So it's not just that they'll stop caring. It's that they'll lose the ability as a science. Like for the last 20 years in the early 2000s when I started, there were still people you could recruit to do this research. But those people are aging out of the field. They're retiring. They're gone. The devices will be shut down, the calorimeters, which again is actually the wrong device to use, but you have to convince people to do experiments that are completely outside of their know-how. They never did it. They didn't train in it. They had no mentorship.
You talk about this almost like you anticipate this could be one of these phases you describe, like earlier in this podcast, where this could be another lost chunk of knowledge because of circumstances of the day.
And it will be. I mean, it couldn't be wrong. Nina Teicholz the other day, she was out in Berkeley and we had coffee and she referred to me as living in my little pessimism bubble. And I was like, yeah, that's a good way to describe it. But So on the one hand, I think, for instance, Jay Bhattacharya is now head of NIH. Jay, I know, understands these issues. We've talked about them. They mean something to him. Perhaps through his influence, we'll get research done that people would not have done otherwise that might settle this issue before, it's hard to do it in 4 years, and maybe he'll last longer than this current administration, who knows. But so that's a positive. That's a good thing. RFK Jr., I've got more mixed feelings about. I don't know what's positive and what's terrible with him. But simultaneously, I do worry about that. You've got the GLP-1 drug. You finally have effective weight loss drugs. Okay, now I and a few other people are arguing. I may be the only one actively arguing that we don't understand how these drugs work, and you're deluding yourself if you think they work by inhibiting appetite. Okay, and I think I know what experiments you could do that could demonstrate this. I know what experiments you could do that could demonstrate this, but I have to get people to care. But in the meanwhile, the world, you hear people talk about these drugs as appetite suppressant drugs, which makes them sound very benign. They float into your head and they make you eat less. It's like, what could be better? And they might be benign. They might be the best God's gift to humanity. We'll find out. But it's sort of...
I think I have some family that are adopting these. And for those challenge cases, given it's the only thing, then it sounds good. But I think we do have science on hand that it's not truly benign. The broader question, as is always the case with any intervention, is the trade-off.
Well, that's the thing. So the trade-off is, and it's an interesting trade-off, because if you don't believe that there's a dietary means to achieve and maintain a healthy weight with relative facility, then there is no trade-off. Then are you going to live longer at like 200 pounds with the drug than you would live at 300 pounds without? But if there's a dietary trade-off, let's say it's 200 pounds with the drug versus 200 pounds with a ketogenic diet, that's a different risk-benefit analysis. That too can be tested, although you got to run the test for 10 or 20 years. Back to the limits of science. But I do feel like the way people think about these drugs is going to influence whether or not they care. I have people online. My friend Ethan, I won't mention his last name other than to say he's a well-known cardiologist in the San Francisco area. And he's constantly he's amazed that I care about the cause of obesity. It's part of the argument I seem to get from him, which is like, what does it matter with all this, whether it's calories or carbs? He eats a ketogenic diet or mostly ketogenic diet. As a physician, he only wants to know what's the best thing for his patients. And I guess this is the difference between a physician and somebody who, pretends to be a scientist, like Dr. McCoy on Star Trek, whatever he was always pretending to be, doctor, I guess.
It's tough because I've come to know a lot of doctors in doing this work, and I definitely believe the vast majority of them are very well intentioned, are looking to do the best for their patients. But at the same time, and I'm not the only person to say this, they will say this themselves. There's a kind of just a perspective that is narrowed down to drugs and surgery, to the extent to where, and I think, if I'm trying to steel man their position, that's what patients want. Patients want the quick fix, or what can I take every day that's going to help, deal with this. But then you've got folks like David Unwin who would say, no, they just aren't having the conversation. If you have the conversation where they can make a choice, then you'd be surprised how many will choose a lifestyle.
Well, this is what I've said, the sort of end place I get in my book, Rethinking Diabetes, my last book, which I think might have been my best and probably sold the least. It's a history of the diet-drug-disease relationship and how the community, in effect, so you can think of diabetes, there's two levers you could pull to control blood sugar. You can pull the insulin lever, or you can pull the diet lever. So the blood sugar is basically a response to the carbohydrate content of the diet, the insulin release in response to the carb content of the diet. So you could add insulin or you could remove carbs. Again, that fear was always, beginning in the 1920s, that if you fed a diet without carbs, you would cause heart disease somehow, which again is sort of doesn't make sense because it implies that carbohydrates are cardioprotective. Right? Like if I add carbs to a carb-free diet, I will prevent heart disease. Carbs are cardioprevent, but these people didn't think of it like that. So you always had these two levers, either remove the carbs or add insulin. And we still basically have those two levers. It's remove the carbs or add some drugs. If not insulin, then GLP-1 agonists or, pick your hypoglycemic medication. We know what the side effects of the medication route is because that's what we've been studying for like 50 years because that's all the medical community decided. So that's very increased risk of, heart disease and nerve disorders and amputations and strokes. And we know that. We don't actually know it for the ketogenic diet, but the ketogenic diet is putting the disease into remission. So you could say, if you sat down with your patients and said, I can give you drugs and we'll control the blood sugar, and then we'll have this spectrum of complications. We're going to have to watch this. We might need to, you might need to go on dialysis in 20 years. 15% of our patients do. You might have your legs amputated. 7% of our patients do. I'm making it up. Even if you very carefully use your drugs, you might still have a stroke or a heart attack. You have increased risk of dementia, Or I could teach you how to eat. Okay. And if I teach you how to eat, as far as we know, you'll have none of these side effects because you'll put the disease itself into remission. We won't have drugs that we have to worry about having side effects. But again, we don't have the long-term clinical trials that tell us for sure there aren't side effects to being on a ketogenic diet with or without type 2 diabetes. But if it was phrased like that, and that's probably how David Unwin phrases
it is.
And more and more people are likely to say, teach me how to eat.
Yeah,
I'm
which
willing.
you could take these lifestyle choices, consider these, or you could be on this medication for the rest of your life. And it's, I think a lot of times people are thinking, oh, I just need to get on this medication for now. And when it's phrased correctly as, well, because you're not doing anything with your lifestyle, without there being some other intervention that we're aware of in this doctor's office that you're doing to change gears, this is perhaps the one route, if you're not going to head this direction. But yeah, and at least last I heard, every single time, not that everybody sticks to it, and maybe they change gears later, but every single time on the first conversation, they take the lifestyle. And
I mean, David's a very compelling guy too.
He is. He convinces me all the time. Every time, I'm always thinking to myself, I wish he was my doctor. I could have him here. What would you say to folks who insist, well, part of why there's no point in pressing for this is it's not sustainable? It's probably one of the most common comments I hear.
I mean, I had this quote. One of the people I interviewed for the diabetes book was kind of the book before that. The 2016, I had a book out called The Case Against Sugar. And one of the guys who interviewed me was a chef turned journalist who had diagnosed type 1 diabetes when he was in his 30s. And after he interviewed me for the sugar book, I said, look, I'm going to be writing a book on diabetes. I want to interview you for my diabetes book, which I did. And he described his experience. So you manifest type 1 diabetes, you're thrown into this world. It's like you've never thought about this disease in your life, and suddenly it's like you're in the deep end and you're desperately trying. So he's diagnosed. The doctor and the diabetes educator come in to talk to him, and they say, the problem is you're no longer secreting insulin, and you need insulin to metabolize the carbohydrates in your diet. So what we want you to do is eat this set amount of carbs before every meal, and at snacks, and then you'll take insulin to cover it. And he says, well, let me get this straight. You're telling me that carbohydrates are now poison to me, and insulin is the antidote, and I should eat the poison and take the antidote. Why don't I just not eat the poison? And they get this like cognitive dissonance look, and then they say, well, that's not sustainable.
Yeah. Right.
And it's like, you're telling me to exercise, right? I'm supposed to, every day, I'm supposed to like change into my gym clothes, run for 45 minutes, change out of my gym clothes, take a shower, wash my gym clothes, repeat the next day. You're not saying that's not sustainable, but not eating bread, pasta, potatoes is unsustainable. It's such a knee-jerk response. And the reason it's a knee-jerk response is because they've been doing these clinical trials where they put people on these diets and they lose weight and they don't stick to the diets after they lose the weight, or they lose weight for 6 months and then the weight comes back because they fall off the diet. You could see this in there when they try to quantify what the people are eating. So they have evidence, what they believe is clinical trial evidence, that these diets are unsustainable, that any diets are unsustainable.
I know this is part of the problem I have is I don't, for people who are doing diets, I think that part of the issue is that there's just kind of this core assumption that the diet needs to do all the work for you. That it's really, you're not going to need to make any choices other than the choices to be on that diet. And I subscribe to the position that actually there's only a small percent of the population that if metabolically challenged for these exact like typical Americans, small percentage for which there's only a behavioral component that needs to change, or there's only the physiological aspects, such as having some kind of disease of accumulation. But that really a large number needs to do both to some degree. The diet can make it easier for you to make the better choices.
Well, I think of it differently. You have to read this great book called The Case for Keto.
Who's the author? I'm curious.
Taubes fellow.
Oh, gosh.
Required reading in this field. So the idea is basically, the carbohydrate insulin model, we've been talking about this off and on. The simplest way to phrase it is carbohydrates are fattening. Okay? For those of us who fatten easily, it's carbohydrates are fattening. Just like, so the metaphor I use when I was a kid, it's simplistic, but when I was a kid, I was allergic to everything. I ironically, considering my career, or coincidentally, rice, wheat, corn, cherries. It's crazy. Corn was the worst. So I couldn't eat corn, or I'd have terrible gastrointestinal problems. So if I didn't want to have gastrointestinal problems, I couldn't eat corn. So I stopped eating corn when I was like 10. Okay, occasionally I'd go to the movie theater, I'd have popcorn anyway, knowing that I was going to regret it, but that was worth it. Okay, but for the most part, I had a corn allergy. I didn't eat corn. Nobody said I was on a corn-free diet, or I was corn restricting, or a corn-restricted diet. It was just I was allergic to corn, couldn't eat it without consequences, so I didn't eat it, and I haven't eaten it for the most part in 60 years. I love corn. Okay, I like corn on the cob. I like cream corn. I like popcorn. I could salivate talking about corn, and occasionally, like I said, I eat it, and I just say I'm gonna deal with the consequences. Like every spring when my relatives pull out their spring corn, it's like, okay, not all of it, but some of it. If carbohydrates are fattening, then you can't eat them. You're not going on a diet. You're not, yes, you are carb restricting, but you are carb restricting because if you eat these foods, they will make you fat. So if you go off them for 6 months and lose your excess weight, but then go back to eating them, they will make you fat 6 months from now, just like they do today. There's no way to get around that if this is right. That's basically the case for keto, with a threshold effect for insulin that you throw in on top of it. But the carbohydrate insulin model says carbohydrates are fattening, not to everyone. The world is full of people who can clearly tolerate it, just like the world is full of people who can smoke cigarettes and don't get lung cancer, 90% of the smokers. Okay, but the rest of them, if you don't want lung cancer, you can't smoke. If you don't want to get fat, you can't eat carbs. But that's not the message that's given in the diet trials. The clinical trials, it's like, let me give you this diet versus that diet. See which works better. These are how diets are. And fundamentally, we believe that whichever diet gets you to eat less is the diet you should be on. So even if you eat less on the carb-restricted diet, keto, or you lose more weight on keto, when we're done with the study, you could switch to any other diet and just make sure you don't eat too much. That's the message. The message isn't carbohydrates are fattening, don't eat them. Hey, look, we got you off carbs. You lost 50 pounds. You might want to stay away from them for the rest of your life because you happen to be one of the unfortunate 50% of Americans that cannot tolerate them. That's not the message that's given. And it's a simple message. It's not a diet. Don't eat the foods that make you fat. Now, the flip side is if energy balance is right, the foods that make you fat are the foods you eat too much of. So you could restrict any calories, in theory, and it doesn't matter which. So if you happen to love potatoes or popcorn or French fries or Coca-Cola or beer, you can keep consuming that, just eat less steak. It's going to give you colon cancer anyway. So just by your perspective, if you believe it's energy balance, you don't have to restrict carbs. You're probably going to restrict carbs if you restrict calories a lot because carbs make up 50% of the calories in most diets, even more, 55 or 60%. So in order to restrict calories freely, you're going to get rid of carbs and you're going to get rid of desserts because you kind of know those are bad. And you're going to get rid of beer because everyone knows beer is fattening, or you're going to switch to light beer or Michelob Ultra, But it's the message is carbs are fattening. That's the carbohydrate insulin model. The reason they're fattening is because of their effect on insulin, but carbs are fattening. If you don't want to be fat, don't eat carbs. It's regrettable. Carbs are delicious.
What do you, what's the response for those who say, well, here's populations like, say, in Japan is a common place for which carbohydrates are a lot more prominent, but they have lower.
Well, this is part of the case against sugar. I mean, I have these discussions, arguments with one of my allies in this world who thinks it's all about glycemic index. He will go unnamed. And I say, well, what about 2 billion Southeast Asians who ate high glycemic index diets and had low levels of obesity? And he said, well, they were very physically active. Okay, so now you're thinking in terms of energy balance and glycemic index. The theory as I see it is basically you add sugar to, and this was the book, the case I've got every. Did you ever see Gilligan's Island?
Oh, yeah.
Remember Tina Louise? I forget what was the name of the character she played? The actress who would always say, oh, yeah, I did a TV show where I played a doctor so I could be a doctor. With me, I wrote a book. It's a case against sugar. The argument was pretty simple. So you've got these populations everywhere in the world that experience obesity and diabetes epidemics when they transition from whatever their traditional diet was, whatever that diet was, to a Western diet and lifestyle. So it doesn't matter if it was a Southeast Asian diet with a lot of rice and wheat, whether it was a Siberian reindeer diet or a Native American diet of, buffalo and elk, or First Nations or a South Pacific Island diet, or add some component of the Western diet, and you end up with obesity and diabetes epidemics and increases in all these. And then the question is, what is that component? The conventional wisdom is that it's too much food availability, ultra-processed food, energy-dense food, whatever you want to call it, and physical inactivity because of all the labor-saving devices that come with the Western world. And this other hypothesis, which predated this and was always there, was that it was sugar, or sugar and white flour, because those are the things that travel around the world, and we discussed this. So if sugar is white flour breaks down primarily to glucose, and that stimulates insulin, and the high glycemic index is a measure of how quickly the blood sugar is, the glucose is absorbed and raises your blood sugar. Sugar itself, sucrose, is half glucose, half fructose, and the molecule fructose has an entirely different metabolic fate. It's absorbed in the small intestine, so a lot of it will have an effect on gut biome, if that means anything. I don't know if it does, and what gets through the small intestine is metabolized primarily in the liver and never gets out of the liver. And there's a lot of biochemistry demonstrating that it's a fructose metabolism in the liver that causes insulin resistance. So you basically get fructose being metabolized, it's converted into triglycerides, fatty acids, and you're getting that in a high insulin environment from the glucose. So there's a lot of insulin around, and the insulin is trying to drive glucose into those same cells that are trying to metabolize the fructose, and you get a kind of traffic jam, and the result is insulin levels keep going up, insulin resistance throughout the body that starts in the liver. This was, as it was explained to me by some very good biochemists, Israeli and American. The Israelis had come from Germany like 40 years, 50 years earlier. And there was research done in the 1950s and 60s implicating a change in sugar consumption with diabetes in populations. So, Southeast Asia, historically very low levels of sugar consumption. That's the short answer. Japan, China, because once you get insulin resistance and begin this epidemic of obesity and diabetes in populations, you're going to get mothers, women, who are becoming insulin resistant, obese, and diabetic when they get pregnant. And they're going to pass this tendency towards obesity and diabetes on to their kids through a process called fetal programming. This is weirdly very well accepted. And it's been put forth by NIH research as an explanation for the diabetes epidemic in the Pima Native American tribe that's so famous for their high diabetes rates in Arizona. So once you start the epidemic, it's going to be exacerbated, and it's going to spread through basically the fetal environment, the mother's diet and the mother's metabolic state. So you add sugar, you start this going, and basically you sit back and wait 50 years. And then you get this explosion of obesity and diabetes of the like that we've been living with since, mid-20th century. So you could see it start here in the mid-19th century, 1850s, 1860s, in the hospital records, coincident with sugar consumption going up, the beginnings of the candy industry and the ice cream industry and the soft drink industry. And then the theory is as that spreads around the world, it basically takes these epidemics with it. Japan is 100 years behind us in sugar consumption. Okay, Vietnam, Thailand, they're all, China, because of communism, is even further behind. They just they didn't import sugar, and they didn't modernize their sugar refineries. So even though the sugar industry was basically born in India and China, It stayed at the level it was in like the 17th, 18th century. That would be the explanation. So the short answer, and I argue with my ally colleague about this all the time. He says glycemic index. I say maybe, but sugar's a better explanation. And just when you write about it, include both, because that's the scientific, function. Like acknowledge that two hypotheses can explain this evidence.
To zero in just a little bit on, you were mentioning sugar. This is very relevant with regard to fructose. Do you allow for the fructose component to be very relevant to the carbohydrate insulin model?
I do, but I have to fight to get into the articles we've published on it.
Because of course, just carbohydrates writ large, that's the larger tent.
Well, so there's, again, two different issues. So and this is where people get confused. One is, how do you start this process going? So how do you start the epidemic? Okay. So we want to light the fuse. What lights the fuse? That's sugar consumption. Add sugar to any diet. Because again, the Southeast Asians already have high refined, high glycemic index diets. So we have to change their diet to start obesity, diabetes epidemics. And even though they are starting, and you could see evidence of them, they're certainly like 50 to 100 years behind us. So what do we add to on a population level to cause these epidemics? And then once the epidemics are in the works and you've got a population that's metabolically dysregulated, that's suffering from they're on this spectrum from overweight to obesity and metabolic syndrome to type 2 diabetes. What do you have to do to reverse that once they have it? So once you have obesity or you have diabetes, just not eating sugar isn't going to make enough of a difference because you've already got dysregulated insulin secretion. The insulin's responding to everything. Might make a little difference, and I'm sure there are people out there who gave up sugar and went from being slightly unhealthy to healthy, but it doesn't make enough of a difference. So now what do you do to make a difference? Well, unfortunately, now that your system is fucked up, it can't tolerate carbohydrates at all. So now we're at ketogenic diets, and that's ultimately the case for keto.
This is super relevant to me because I'll concede I was the divide. I myself make this divide line all the time. I say there seems to be a lot of debate as to how you get to this place of severe insulin resistance. But after you have severe insulin resistance, and I usually online, I always call it like severe diabetes or severe insulin resistance, specifically qualifying severe, because I'm curious about who wants to make the case to me that somebody with severe diabetes doesn't need to be concerned with their carbohydrate intake. I'm open-minded to what might be brought forward, but I have not been able to see something, again,
well, if it helps, if you'd like, I'll argue that on Twitter, and there are people out there who will disagree with anything I say, even if it's 2 + 2 = 4. So
true. I've watched it in real time, but the carbohydrate insulin model is often described, typically by critics of it, that carbs cause obesity, just straight up. But what you're articulating, I think, at least for me, is a bit more plausible into the specific characteristics of sugar, particularly refined forms, from what I've seen personally, but also just thinking through. And I should emphasize something. I'm so much more into lipids than I am into nutrition, even for as much as I wander around the low-carb space.
Well, and I'm more interested in nutrition, which is why I don't get involved in lipid discussions. I know my limits.
Exactly. So I tend to not be too much of a stakeholder in this. I'm not. So even though I work with Nick and Adrian and your colleague, for example, I mean, at least as far as on the lipid side of the fence, I'm kind of watching from a distance as things are unfolding on the carbohydrate insulin model side of the fence. But there is no getting around this one fact, which is, and it is a fact, insulin is the central anabolic hormone. I don't see any argument with what Ben Bikman said, which is any weight loss diet is going to ultimately be a low insulin diet.
Yes, he said that because I said that, and I love
you
Ben,
said that.
but I said it first.
Oh, okay, very well. Fair enough.
And I probably said it. I don't know if Finney and Volek said it or not, and certainly Eric doesn't think that way, but I would have gotten it from probably Mark Friedman ultimately.
Yeah. But it is true, right? I mean, as long as hyperinsulinemia is in place, you're fighting chemistry and biochemistry quite literally. I don't know what you can do about it. So
not eat carbs.
Yeah.
Get rid of the hyperinsulinemia, which is the consequence of both the insulin resistance and the carb consumption. It's one of the issues I have with all of this, which is, we talked about how doctors think and how they narrow their perspective. They also have a tendency to be assertive about hypotheses being true. I notice this much among our allies as I do among, the people who think I'm an idiot. What I'm asking is, and what amazes me is that getting back to this method of multiple working hypotheses, if there's two hypotheses that can explain the data, mention them both and say that. Okay, you don't say, here's my favorite hypothesis, this is why this is true, here's the evidence, I believe it, we're done, and ignore the alternative. You've got to discuss one in the context of the other or the multiple possible hypotheses and mention them all because they're all viable. So it may be true that that diets work when people eat less. But it may also be true that diets work because you lower insulin, whether or not you eat less. So discuss both of them. How do you harm, what benefit comes from stating one as a fact and ignoring the other? And again, this is with my colleague when we argue the sugar glycemic index thing. It's like they're both possible. I know that you don't find the sugar evidence compelling, and I don't find the glycemic index evidence compelling. I'm not saying don't mention that, only mention sugar, mention them both. They're different mechanisms. It could be glycemic index, it could be the fructose metabolism in the liver. Mention them both. Because if you don't, people are going to come along, they're going to read this paper, and they're not going to know that there's an alternative hypothesis. So it's going to collapse their worldview and their perspective. What they see is going to be different.
I mean, it's quite literally putting all your eggs in one basket.
It is, but it's denying the existence of the other basket implicitly or explicitly, and other people have to do this science also.
Almost like saying putting all your credibility in one basket.
Well, again, I think they get in the habit. Doctors, I don't understand. It does seem to be something medical doctors do, but I deal with doctors more than I deal with other scientists these days. And as I've said, I'm not sure how many of the nutrition, obesity, chronic disease people I would consider scientists with air quotes. But the tendency to just assert that this is true. This is what I believe, therefore this is true. And there's no humility. There's none of these caveats. There's none of this could be true. We'll have these debates on this email chain I'm on of, with a couple hundred physicians who think the way we do and are in our world, low carb, high fat, keto world. And I'm often saying, look, from my perspective, this is how I interpret the data. And I'm saying it in response to somebody saying, like the most recent is insulin resistance is caused by dysregulated, visceral fat storage. I said, where did that come from? It's funny, I did an article. I think it's also a difference between how journalists think and to some extent the podcast experience. Remember, what you see is all there is. So if you're a podcaster like, my buddy Peter Attia, for instance, you might interview one expert on a subject and then you speak to them for 3 hours and that's the perspective you get. But if you're a journalist writing a review, not breaking news, but the kind of science journalism I used to do in my youth, you write for a monthly or a weekly and you you're going to write a piece. One I did was on insulin resistance, and I want to know the mechanism. So I got an assignment, did it for Science, and interviewed all the leading authorities in insulin resistance. And I learned that there were sort of 3 different viewpoints. Okay, 3 different labs. All 3 of them insisted they were right. All 3 of them, weirdly enough, had developed animal models that refuted the other hypotheses, which was like, this is crazy. None of them happened to be my hypothesis. So again, even the visceral fat accumulation, it just, but when you interviewed them, if you only interviewed them, you'd never know there were competing hypotheses. If you state something is true assertively, we wrote a review article on Mark Friedman did virtually all of the writing and the bulk of the heavy lifting, and it's a culmination of his whole career. And then I got to be a co-author, and David Ludwig and a couple of Danes from Copenhagen, and we had considerable input, and the drafts went back and forth for a year. I mean, it was probably 3 months of our life and a year total of Mark's life. But even Mark wanted to write about this, we called it fat trapping, hypothesis of obesity, fuel partitioning, this sort of bigger hypothesis in which the carbohydrate insulin model lives. He wanted to do without ever mentioning energy balance. I said, this isn't about that. It's about the hypothesis of, and I said, Mark, it's always about that. The energy balance is a conventional wisdom. It's how people think about this. You cannot mention one hypothesis and not mention the other. I'm not saying, because if nothing else, your readers are going to go, well, it's energy balance.
Because they're going to draw that comparison anyway.
They're going to come draw it anyway. So it's sort of, we're arguing that energy balance can't explain anything that we're discussing in this 8,000 word dense scientific paper. And, but nonetheless, you have to say that this is what we're arguing, that energy balance is not an explanation, and this is. When you're discussing 2 viable hypotheses, you have to mention them both. If there are 5 viable hypotheses, you have to mention. It gets problematic because if you don't think the hypothesis is viable, there's a protein leverage hypothesis I think is inane, but other people take it seriously. So do I have to mention the protein leverage hypothesis? Actually, it is an energy balance model because it implies that if you don't eat enough protein, you will eat too many calories, and that's why you will get fat. So it's embraced as an energy, but again, it gets complicated.
It's a flavor. Yeah. I mean, I agree. If there's a prominent hypothesis of the day that's likely going to be compared to the one that you're putting forward, I feel like there's more risk in not, making that something you're going to discuss openly. Obviously, in our case, it's pretty obvious. It's a lipid hypothesis. Right. Therefore, there's just going to be already that kind of baked in assumption.
Let me ask you one question, then we'll wrap up. But I want to ask you a question about the familiar hypercholesterolemia. I've seen it argued, I think, by people on our side of the quack side of the controversy, that FMH does not raise heart disease risk, that these people live longer than... okay, so maybe I'm just misunderstanding it. And when I go and look at the studies, in the 1960s, it seems clear that the FMH kills people young.
Yeah. Homozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. I know it's a mouthful. Means that you, on both sides, on the mother and father, you've got the mutation that, the classic one that Brown and Goldstein were looking at was the poor receptor binding on the LDL receptor. There's technically 4 of them, but they're all severe, and they all associate with both extremely high LDL cholesterol and ApoB and early cardiovascular disease.
Right.
And they usually live shorter lives, those with HoFH, homozygous FH. Now, if it's only on one parent, then it's heterozygous familial hypercholesterolemia. And in that case, the waters are a little more murky. They may have earlier cardiovascular disease, but the all-cause mortality, there's a bit of a mixture in the studies out there, which is where I think you're picking this up from. Where it gets challenging is that...
But it's the later studies, or is it the earlier?
Yeah, as in if they didn't...
Well, they wouldn't have known.
Right. If they're diagnosed later in life, then yes, they tend to die more of cardiovascular disease, but seem to die less of non-cardiovascular disease later in life. Again, this area is a bit trickier to speak to. What I would say is a problematic confounder for me in examining it in either direction is that a lot of times these are lipid clinics for which they're discovered, right? Only recently has there been things like GWAS across whole countries to where there could be more effective even epidemiology around this. If you're discovering them from lipid clinics where there's already, say, abnormalities appearing, then there's a problem because that gets back to the self-selectedness issue, right? So what's more interesting and definitely more relevant in this case is there is now an understanding that there's 3 classifications you can make between those who have familial hypercholesterolemia that's genetic and it's monogenetic, as in there's just one gene that has a big difference, and this is one of them. Polygenetic, which means there's a combination between the genetics that between the combination can result in a likewise level of LDL that's very high. And then no known genetic, which is this third category. But these do not have equivalent risks, these 3 categories. The monogenetic has the high risk independently. The polygenetic has, and if my math remembers correct, if I'm remembering this correctly, it's like 2.1 HR over here in the monogenetic, 1.3 in the polygenetic, and 1.0 is the reference in the known, right? That's like a huge disparity between the 3 for the same LDL cholesterol levels.
Right.
This is sort of the problem I have with the fact that they don't have hard classifications for FH. It's loosened up and loosened up and loosened up to where just having
high cholesterol.
Yeah, having high cholesterol. This
is, by the way, what I was talking about earlier with. It's a great example of do you look at the positive data, you look at the negative data. What do you pay attention to, and do you pay attention to the anomalous observations? So what you're doing is saying, I'm looking at the difference between, mono and no classification, and then what does LDL have to do with it? If I look at the difference, that's anomalous. That's an anomalous observation that your theory, that seems to refute your theory. But if they're only looking at mono, high cholesterol, high LDL, high death rate, that confirms their theory. So they only care, they're paying attention to the positive energy. People like us come along and we pay attention to the anomalous observations, the other evidence, and then we try to get them to care. While always questioning the fact that what are the odds that a software engineer in Vegas and a freelance journalist could make significant contributions to medical science? And frankly, it's tiny. I mean, even
100%.
If they were open-minded, it would still be, infinitesimal odds that we could be right. So if you're just betting on it, if this was a poker table, you're like, fold this hand, dude. Okay.
Yeah.
This guy's not winning. I mean, he's not right.
Right.
He can't be right. He's a software engineer from Vegas. He didn't even go to Harvard.
And I would be the same way if my mechanic came out and said, yeah, no, actually, I think it's this way. And he's giving an explanation. I'm like, well, do you have a degree in this? And he doesn't, right?
Have you worked in a
Yeah.
mechanic? Have you worked in an auto repair shop?
Right.
No.
But for what it's worth,
But I've been Googling a lot.
right? Exactly. But for what it's worth, this is where the experiments were so crucial. Those early experiments, like, okay, let me give you an example. Right this moment in time, I could have you write down a number between 75 and 350. And I would be willing to bet you a sizable amount of money that in 7 days I can change the cholesterol in my bloodstream, the LDL cholesterol in specific, to within 30 milligrams per deciliter of that number. Now, that might sound like a huge parlor trick, but I can stand behind that. The reason
this is why I wanted you to
But
convince. This is why we had that conversation with Peter about what would convince him.
Right.
What experiments could he do? Because if you could do that, he could do that. And if he could do that, he might learn from it.
I could do that because I've got my metabolism mapped from all of these blood tests I did before. Two, I know what I'm willing to do. And almost nobody is willing to go on the kinds of diets that I would require that they go on, which is pretty standard fare for carnivore, but it's not that palatable for many people who are already naive to the diet. Usually it takes somebody who has a particular reason to be on a diet like that. Either because it's efficacious. They're dealing with, like in the case of Nick, it's his ulcerative colitis, or the people in the movie, like Robin Dobbins, it's for her bipolar, etc. Yeah. Or they really just need it to be that categorical to get to the real weight loss. But in my case, I was very motivated because I was changing my lipids like crazy. And it was great. It was fantastic to be able to prove that.
Well, this is why I always found your stuff compelling. As far as I know, you're the first person who ever did that. And the first person who ever does something, sees things. It's like you had, you create a new telescope, right, that can see further into the universe, or at the wavelengths that have never before been seen. You're going to see things that nobody else has seen before, and you're going to make scientific discoveries. Your body became the equivalent of your telescope. Nobody had ever done this before. That's impressive. I mean, are you interpreting what you see correctly? Who knows? But you did something, you got to observe something that no one had ever observed before.
And it was fun. And it was a lot of fun.
I mean, that's when I did Good Calories, Bad Calories, the research I did, nobody had ever done that research. People had written histories of dieting in effect, and they'd called them obese, but nobody ever looked at the history of obesity research. Or and said, whoa, there's things you can see that nobody's ever seen before, and they change how we think about this. The problem is then you do an experiment or write a paper or you write books, and you think because you wrote them, somehow people will read them and that will change the world. And then another kind of naivete kicks in. I mean, even like saying to you, you really have to read The Case for Keto. You really should read The Case for Keto. I wrote this book because I thought, people have to originally it was called How to Think About How to Eat, and then I had to change the title. But it's sort of, there are ways to think. And I don't read, like if you write a book, I'm not going to read it. Unless you ask for a blurb, in which case I might read it. But otherwise, life is, I'm busy. I got kids. I've
been through two of your books. It's just, you do write a lot of books.
Well, because that's all I do.
Yeah.
So I have time, and I mean, the diabetes book, I remember I won't get it, but it's research for that was remarkable. I mean, it was revelatory. It's fascinating because between Google Books and other internet repositories, these things had become available to read. Well, you didn't even have to go to a library anymore. It's like I could download entire textbooks and monographs from the 19th century and, put together the whole history of a field that had never been done. Nobody had ever written there's a couple histories of diabetes, but they very much sort of drug disease histories. Nobody had done this drug diet disease combination, that relationship. Fascinating. Could I get people to read it? I mean, it's a difficult read, I have to say. It's not exactly a page turner, although it is for a medical text. But anyway, it's just, but you think because it's there, it should change how people think, but they actually have to. Yeah.
I'm a big believer in the 10% rule. You probably heard of this, which is it's not like there's a linear change over time. Like you get 7% this year, and then you get 7% the next year, et cetera. It's that the hardest change is that first 10%. And that first 10%, it's like these open-minded people in the middle. Yeah, they kind of carry the main paradigm opinion for a while, but now the data, they're really digesting it. They're going, yeah, I'm starting to think so-and-so may be right about XYZ. And then they actually have more of an impact as those minds
so
change.
it's sort of
and then it becomes a tipping point. At like 10% all of a sudden now.
But the problem with the tipping point theory was always what Gladwell conveniently left out of his book, is that you never know, is it 10% or 20% or 24% or 33%? You never know when you're going to get to the tipping point. God doesn't give you that information either.
Yeah.
And you don't even know if there is no tipping point.
Well, and in our case, it's a more interesting, because I've had this hypothetical with many other guests, but I'll put it forward. It's 2025 right now where we're recording this. If we were to go back 10 years ago, 2015, and I were to bring the cohort that we have here, right, with an average LDL of like 255, right, and I were to say, hey, these are otherwise metabolically healthy people, but their LDL is 255. Their average ApoB is 185, and they've been on this for 5.5 years. What do you think? Do you think that they'll have a pronounced increase in plaque? And I think 10 years ago, a bar full of cardiologists from a cardiology conference would be like, oh yeah, definitely. I would take bets on that. But I could get a lot of bets on them. I'll bet today it'd be different. I bet the reason why is because the identification of lean mass hyperresponders is surprisingly, like I'm surprised, is actually somewhat well known now within like even the NLA. There was a somebody shared this with me who had attended one recently, but there was a lecture that was happening where somebody said, show of hands who's heard of these like lean mass hyperresponders. Like a third of the hands went up.
Oh, that's
which
good.
blew me away just to hear this, right? But the point being is that they have their own patient pools. This lean mass hyperresponder is a new phenomenon for reasons you were elucidating from earlier. Atkins wasn't appealing to athletes before. They were for the people who had given up and were like really overweight and willing to just try anything. They had the attitude you did.
I get it.
It's recently that we had people who are metabolically healthy choose to be on a low carb ketogenic
Well, this is
diet.
why, I mean, one of the things when I'm depressed at 3 a.m. and I try to say, hey, look, you've actually made a difference. Okay. But even in fields like metabolic psychology, the reason that field exists is because we got to the point where, like Chris Palmer at Harvard, affiliated Harvard Hospital, could put one of his patients with schizophrenia on Atkins without worrying about killing him or being sued that it was unethical. And then seeing that, just as you saw that these athletes are doing this diet and getting very high cholesterol. Hey, people with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, when they do these diets, their delusions go into remission. So it's sort of like you start this thing and it spreads. And this is a point I make in the case for keto, which is that you've got, no matter how much pushback there is. I actually gave a talk on this last year at the ketogenic diet for epilepsy conference. But you start with anecdotal evidence, N's of 1. Like diabetes starts in 1797 with one doctor and one patient. Doctor puts a patient on a type 1, who's got diabetes on an animal diet, fatty meat and green vegetables, and the diabetes goes into remission. Tries another patient, diabetes goes into remission, writes a pamphlet, circulates the pamphlet around England, and people says, try this diet because I think I've figured out a way to beat diabetes. And doctors try the diet with their patients. This is a era when the doctor is lucky to see one or unlucky to see one diabetic patient in a career. And it seems to work, and it becomes standard of care, and it sort of slowly spreads. And in the 1920s, it's being used for diabetes on a kid with epilepsy, and the seizures go away. And now it's a treatment for epilepsy, and they forget about the fact that it's a treatment for diabetes because you got insulin by that point.
But even then, it got lost even for the epilepsy, it became big and then it went away
Well,
for a while because of the
people
medication.
assume there are different issues with epilepsy, and this was part of the lecture. Once you had drugs that work, drugs are easier. Okay, drugs are more reliable, and people are going to stay on the drugs. And epilepsy is one of those diseases. So the fear is always, what if they fall off the diet and what happens? And so if you fall off the diet and have a major seizure, you might die. Okay, but if you're on the drugs, you're less likely to fall off the drugs. Even if you don't like the drugs, your parents are going to know whether you're taking the drugs or whatever it is. So there's always this fear, the what if the diet stops working or it doesn't work, and then it became, what if it gives them heart disease? So who cares if it's, with obesity, who cares of it? But it always starts with an anecdote, and then the anecdotes feed into others. It's interesting. Atkins did it because this guy Pennington did it. Pennington had read about it because Donaldson wrote about it. He had read Donaldson's book, but then they always try it on themselves. So you read the book, you try it on yourself, it works, and then you go, hey, maybe I'll try it on my patients. You tell your patients, look, this might kill you, but look at me. Or your patient says, hey, doc, what have you been doing? You look great. You lost like 30 pounds. He goes, I've been doing this crazy low carb thing, but it just keeps spreading because it works.
Right. It gets back to that purity component. It's so, again, we'll say this and I'll wrap up, but I'm still at odds with the concept of things like these broad-based guidelines, this sort of attempt to make this one size fits all, and all of the problems that surround just trying the approach of doing it that way. I want doctors to get back to being scientists the way that you're just describing right now.
Well, but this is, and there was a rationale for that too, but I do think it was interesting in the diabetes world, the Diabetes Association, American Diabetes Association, just like the American Heart Association 20 years later, might have done more harm than good because they decide that it is their job to give guidelines. And guidelines become basically conventional consensus wisdom for most patients who we're going to tell all patients to do.
But they also become a source of fear. You then...
Well, that's because then you can get sued if you do something
right.
that does more harm than good, or appears to do more harm than good, but simultaneously, the doctors were probably doing that. So there were physicians, we all know crazy physicians or crazy physicians in our world who would have, I'm always asking people, like, how do you know that's true? Like, you say, you've got these careful prescriptions for how to manipulate lipid numbers, I give this drug for that and this for that and this vitamin for that, right?
But in particular also the combinations of them. Like this drug helps with X, but it causes symptoms Y and Z. Oh, that's all right. We've got drugs that help with symptoms
which
Y
is what
and
you
Z.
end up exactly. That's what the diabetes.
But there's no study that did a combination of those drugs, so you don't know if their interaction is.
But again, as soon as you're doing preventive medicine, you never know, and a lot of what's happened is a shift to preventive medicine. Say what you want about GLP-1s, at least they're treating a symptom. And they do a very good job at it. That symptom is excess weight, and they get rid of it. So in that sense, that's a benefit. Then the question becomes, do you live longer or shorter? Because you've treated the symptom. The world is there are drugs you could give people that'll make them lose weight because it'll make them sick. And then it'll kill them. But on the way, they'll lose weight. So it's sort of like you can disassociate treating the symptom. And keto could be one of them. We should probably wrap it up. It's been going for a while.
Go ahead and tell us how people find you, and tell us. Can you say anything about the coming book?
I hope I get it written, and I've got probably a few thousand articles, chapters, textbooks, monographs. various languages. And at the moment, I have to do my Substack to afford to keep working on the book.
The Substack.
The Substack is called Uncertainty Principles. Okay, I thought about calling it Principles of Uncertainty because a lot of what I'm talking about is how to deal with uncertainty. Ultimately, when you're talking about science, you're dealing with what you don't know and what you're not certain about, and it's about communicating and elucidating, turning the uncertainty into certainties. It's how you discuss it, how you think about it. But obviously, my focus is nutrition, chronic disease. I mean, that's the subjects I know best now. Wasn't always, but now it's. So most of it is on aspects of that. I hope someday to write about even like whether dark matter is true or modified Newtonian dynamics, known as MOND. But
You'd like to take a break from this whole nutrition space? It sounds
you know,
like.
I fantasize about going back and talking to good scientists someday. Those days may be over. Anyway, Principles of Uncertainty is the title of a book by Marion Kalman, so I couldn't use that. It was a pretty well-known book, but Uncertainty Principles was available. So every 2 weeks, I really like doing it, actually. Writing I find difficult and tiresome and a little depressing, but it's nice. When you're writing a book, you're working on it. It's like something comes out every 4 years, and then you get this burst of interest, and then it's, the plateaus at some level, but it's nice to get feedback from people on a time scale shorter than multiple years. And then Twitter, Gary Taubes, GaryTaubes.com, but it's the Substack, Uncertainty Principles, that people should subscribe to.
Well, thanks for coming and joining us.
Thanks for having me, Dave.
Thank you for tuning in for this episode with Gary Taubes. And don't forget, we keep the lights on because we pay the bills. So as long as you continue to support us, getting your private blood testing through Own Your Labs, then we can keep this podcast going and growing. Until next time.